So I'm greatly honored to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I suppose after having done 8 or 10 of these, my number one takeaway out of all of these meetings has been that Canadians don't know much about what the military actually does. That's the number one takeaway. And that's kind of good news, but it's also kind of bad news. So I'm going to do a 35,000 foot exercise, and I'm going to skip 2/3 of it. The first and foremost responsibility of any government is the defense of the nation. I'm not going to get into that. In our case, the secondary but equally important responsibility, interlinked, is the defense of North America. But I'm not going to get into that. The third, and possibly, and the one that certainly gets all of the publicity, is our expeditionary things. And you know you're in the military when you have a map. You know. So I put up a map here, and I wanted to talk about 3 things. I wanted to talk about peacekeeping, peacemaking, threat, conflict resolution. I wanted to talk about non-state actors, and then I want to talk about what I think what a lot of people want to talk about is the particular state actor that we are currently dealing with. First of all, with respect to conflict resolution, we're into this dialogue of the deaf, whether we are a warrior nation or a peacekeeping nation. Well, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, we're both simultaneously. And really, the Canadian military is in the business of conflict resolution. And sometimes that conflict is a pretty hot conflict, and sometimes that conflict is not quite so hot. So you've heard a lot of conversation, for instance, about Mali. And there's some active conversation about in the government as to whether we are in fact going to send quote-unquote peacekeepers over to Mali. Peacekeeping is not like the image some of us might have of Pearsonian peacekeepers in Cyprus, where you stand, you watch the one line over here and the other line over there, and you stand in the center, and hopefully they don't shoot at you. This will be a very active mission. And it does relate to significant geopolitical implications as to where Daesh, ISIS, various and sundry names goes next, particularly across the Maghreb. If in fact we do go into that, Canada has a unique advantage in that many of our troops speak French. And so we may actually be going there, but they will be very heavily armed. There's been, I think, 68 peacekeepers have been killed in the last little while. And it was largely to keep the Israelis and the Egyptians from fighting with each other. And so a UN peace mission was established there. A Canadian general is in charge of that mission. And his chief task is not so much keeping the Israelis and the Egyptians apart. Rather, his chief task is to keep, if you will, a watching brief on what ISIS is doing in coming in through Gaza and engaging with the Egyptian troops. And that, for some, may well be an area that destabilizes very quickly. But it is a Canadian general that is in charge of that, and he's had to pull back. At one point, there was a number of, if you will, branches out from the main base, and all of them have been closed and blown up. And so now the area is heavily fortified, and every once in a while, ISIS leaves a little note and says, "Well, we can do some nasty things to you," and thus far haven't. It's not an area that's got a lot of publicity, but it's an area that's being watched very carefully and may heat up very quickly, especially if there is some success, particularly in and around Iraq. Third mission. So. Those are so-called peacekeeping, peacemaking missions. Third is with the non-state actors. You'll know that when our government became the government, we withdrew the jets and upped our commitment to training the Peshmerga. We have since really upped that mission with a variety of assets, and we continue to organize, if you will, the Peshmerga for the eventual assault on Mosul. We also have a mission in Baghdad. A Canadian general there, again, is in charge. And his chief task, and I'm putting this somewhat colloquially, is to run around between the Minister of Defense, the Minister of the Interior, the Shia militia, the Bedouin, and the Iraqi security forces, and stop them from fighting with each other. Now, he's had some success. Fallujah has largely been taken, but there's been that's not been without some considerable input on the part of a Canadian general, and this I refer to as, if you will, our role as in military diplomacy. So that's the non-state actors, so peacemaking, peacekeeping, non-state actors with Daesh and various and sundry entities that are acting in the Middle East. And then, of course, up the Eastern European, Western Russian, whatever border, however you wish to describe it. We did have a training mission in Romania. And then, of course, we've been in Ukraine. I was there with the minister in March. We started off in Lviv. We went to the mission itself. We watched the training. It's interesting that Borys talked about the individual who was injured. One of our major elements in our training mission is medical training, which had been woefully lacking. And so we were treated to a demonstration of how the Ukrainian military now withdraws its injured people. Apparently it was a fairly crude operation. Now it is a far more sophisticated operation, and it's measurable, the number of people that are being saved. Small arms fire, we were treated to a live demonstration on that. Again, Ukrainian soldiers are very brave, very able, but really do lack some training. We've also provided some policing and also some lectures and training on the rules of law, the law of war. And then there's a kind of a lot of soft stuff that goes on. And I remember a conversation with one of our people there talking about the chain of command and how he treats his corporals and his privates and his sergeants, the enlisted, and how the Ukrainian generals look at how he, as a colonel or a major, treats his, and it is a bit of an education. And you might think that that's all kind of soft stuff. Well, bear in mind, a lot of the Ukrainian senior leadership is a Soviet-trained leadership, and they have a very clear idea of command and control. That doesn't necessarily work in 2016. So there's a lot of hard things that are going on, but there's also a lot of soft stuff that's going on as well, and we continue to be engaged. And I have to say that both the minister and I came away very impressed with the ability of the Ukrainian soldiers and the upgrading of their ability to actually approach. I think it's probably an overstatement on my part, but I think we like to think, at least, we had something to do with the fact that in the East, at least, that is a frozen conflict. As you know, you'll probably know better than I, that at one point was not a frozen conflict, and that there was real possibility that Mr. Putin's troops would have taken a far greater chunk of the real estate than they currently have. So kudos to the Ukrainian military, and I think also kudos to our own people who've done some really serious training. We then went to Poland, and in Poland we're doing a basic military exercise there, training our own people. Now, the developments that have happened since then has been our commitment to Latvia. There'll be 4 framework nations. The British will be in Estonia. The Germans will be in Latvia. The Americans will be in Poland. Sorry, Lithuania. The Germans are in Lithuania, and we are in Latvia. Each is committed to 1,000 people. We are putting up 450 and filling with other nations' troops. And so that will be the framework, and the Canadian will be in charge of that Latvian mission. Let me just give you a little anecdote about Canada's relationship with Latvia. In September 2001, I was traveling with John Manley, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and our agenda was to go from London to Paris to Riga to Berlin. And so when we arrived in Riga, we were met by the president, who's a Latvian Canadian, Vika Freiberg. And I remember this meeting about as clearly as I remember any of these meetings, which kind of go off into nowhere sometimes. And she wanted into NATO. Boy, did she want into NATO. She didn't care about the European Union. She didn't want to talk about monetary currency, things of that nature. She just wanted into NATO. And for those of you from that part of the world, you can appreciate how, in particular, the Balts are very concerned about how they have, if you will, become the highway of exploitation, whether it's German or whether it's Russian. And so when they see Crimea, it's, hold it, I've seen this movie. I didn't like it the first time. I don't think I'm going to like it, how this turns out. And so it was interesting. Here we are 15 years ago, September 2001, the president of Latvia is all over our foreign minister saying, we need into NATO. So she knew we were going to Germany, so the next day we went to Berlin, sat down with the foreign affairs minister, and John, to his great credit, made the case for Latvia getting into NATO. And at that point, it was a coalition government. And so the minister sat there, and the two coalition partners sat on either side of him. And they had this debate as to whether Latvia should be allowed into NATO. And it was, of course, a debate that's probably pretty familiar to a lot of you as to how you will impact will you, in effect, poke the Russian bear. So here we are 15 years later, and we are actually involved with Latvia. The final thing I wanted to say is it's very interesting to me to see the Baltic nations in particular very keen on getting NATO present, because Mr. Putin's troops are not that far away. It's also interesting to me to have the Finns and the Swedes giving serious thought to whether they want to be involved with NATO as well. So let me just finish there. So we are doing peacekeeping, peacemaking. That's a clear mandate on the part of Mr. Trudeau. We are involved in military diplomacy. We are doing training for fights or conflicts with non-state actors, and we are really into it as far as involvement in East European issues. And I don't think any one of those issues is going to go away soon. Hence, your advice to us is extremely important, because we have some pretty serious decisions to make, and so we're really keen to hear what you might have to say. So thank you again for your time and attention. Appreciate it.